Look at a map of modern Europe. Trace your finger across the borders of Germany, Poland, and Russia. You will find ancient cities, quiet rivers, and vast plains. But you will not find Prussia. It has been erased, wiped from the earth so thoroughly that it feels like a myth. Yet, for 3 centuries, this phantom state was the dark, beating heart of European history. How does a nation simply disappear? To understand the death of Prussia, we must first understand its terrifying birth. The philosopher Voltaire once observed, "Where some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state." This was not a joke, it was a diagnosis. Prussia was not a country in the traditional sense. It was a philosophy made of iron and blood. It was the ultimate manifestation of human discipline overriding the chaos of nature. We often think of empires as grand, wealthy institutions, born of fertile lands and strategic ports. Prussia had none of these. It was born in the dirt. It was born from paranoia. It was an empire forged not by divine right, but by an absolute existential terror. And, in its desperate quest to survive, it built a machine of such flawless mechanical perfection that it eventually devoured its own creators. This is the story of the Prussian experiment. Every great philosophy is born from a great suffering. For the entity that would become Prussia, that suffering was the 30 Years' War. Imagine a conflict so catastrophic that it wiped out nearly a third of the population in Central Europe. Entire villages vanished, fields rotted. For decades in the 17th century, the lands of Brandenburg, the cradle of Prussia, were treated as a highway for foreign armies. Swedes, imperials, mercenaries, they marched through, burned, pillaged, and left. The people of Brandenburg learned a brutal, unforgiving lesson. If you are weak, the world will not pity you, it will erase you. Geographically, Brandenburg, Prussia made no sense. It was a fragmented patchwork of territories separated by hundreds of miles. Worse still, it had no natural borders. No towering mountain ranges to block an invasion, no wide oceans to serve as a moat. It was entirely flat, just sand, pine trees, and freezing wind. The rest of Europe mockingly called it the sandbox of the Holy Roman Empire. But in this barrenness, a unique psychological identity began to form. When geography offers you no protection, you must build walls out of men. You cannot rely on nature. You can only rely on order. The trauma of helplessness birthed a deep cultural obsession with control. The chaos of the outside world was so terrifying that the only logical response was to create a society of absolute, unyielding discipline. They did not build a military to conquer, not yet. They built a military so they would never have to be victims again. If trauma was the soil, Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, was the dark gardener. Taking power in 1640, he inherited ruins. But he understood the philosophical truth of his era. Sovereignty is an illusion without the monopoly on violence. He realized that his fragmented lands could only be held together by a single, terrifyingly efficient institution, a standing army. But armies are expensive, and his lands were poor. How do you fund a war machine without money? You do it by fundamentally rewriting the social contract. Frederick William looked at the nobility of his land, the Junkers. In the rest of Europe, nobles were a threat to the king, constantly rebelling and demanding rights. The Great Elector made them a different offer, a Faustian bargain. He told the Junkers, "Surrender your political independence to me, and in return, I will give you absolute dominion over your peasants, and I will make you the exclusive officer class of my new, glorious army." It was a masterstroke of human engineering. He did not destroy the elite, he weaponized them. The Junkers traded their liberty for purpose. They stopped being independent lords and became cogs in a magnificent, terrifying machine. Honor was no longer found in individual glory or wealth. Honor was found strictly in service to the state. This was the birth of Prussian militarism. It was not just about carrying a musket, it was a spiritual transformation. Obedience became the highest moral virtue. The state became God. The machine was built, but it required a madman to perfect it. That man was King Frederick William I, the grandson of the great Elector, who took the throne in 1713. History remembers him as the Soldier King. If you want to understand the soul of Prussia, look at him. While other European monarchs draped themselves in silk, powdered their wigs, and built extravagant palaces like Versailles, Frederick William I wore a simple, unadorned military uniform every single day of his life. He despised luxury. He saw art, philosophy, and comfort as diseases that weakened the human spirit. He operated his kingdom like an ascetic monk leading a cult of war. He slashed the royal budget, fired the court musicians, and poured every single coin into the army. Under his rule, an astonishing 80% of the state's revenue was spent on the military. By the end of his reign, this tiny, impoverished realm possessed the fourth largest army in Europe. But his true genius and his true madness lay in the canton system. He divided his entire country into military districts. Every male child born in Prussia was registered for the army the moment he took his first breath. The entire society was reorganized to feed the military apparatus. The schools taught military drills. The churches preached obedience to the king and the chain of command. He created an army that could fire 3 volleys a minute, while their enemies could only fire 2. He achieved this through a discipline so severe, so psychologically crushing, that soldiers were taught to fear their own officers more than they feared the enemy. Yet, for all his obsession with war, the Soldier King never actually started one. He was a hoarder of power. He built the most devastating weapon Europe had ever seen, but kept it locked in its scabbard. He created a masterpiece of violence, waiting for a philosopher to wield it. And that philosopher would be his son, a boy he abused and despised, a boy who would go down in history as Frederick the Great. To understand the paradox of Frederick the Great, you must first witness the murder of his innocence. If his father, the Soldier King, was a man of iron, young Frederick was a creature of silk. He was a boy who despised the agonizing drill of the parade ground. He played the flute. He composed poetry. He read French philosophy in secret, hiding forbidden books of the Enlightenment beneath the floorboards of his austere military quarters. He dreamed of a world governed by reason, art, and discourse, rather than the brutal mathematics of artillery and infantry lines. But in Prussia, the state does not permit a private soul. The state demands total alignment. The clash between the brute father and the poet's son was not merely a family dispute, it was a philosophical war for the future of the nation. Frederick William I saw his son's artistic temperament not as a quirk, but as a treasonous disease that would destroy the magnificent military machine he had built. The beatings were frequent and public. The king would strike the crown prince in front of the troops, humiliating him, trying to beat the softness out of his flesh. Driven to despair, at 18 years old, Frederick attempted to flee. He plotted an escape to England with his closest friend and rumored lover, a young officer named Hans Hermann von Katter. But they were caught. What followed was a psychological crucifixion. The king accused his own son of treason and threatened him with execution. But the true punishment was far more diabolical. Frederick was imprisoned in a fortress and forced to the window. In the courtyard below, a scaffold had been built. There, the king's executioners brought out Katter. Frederick screamed, begging for his friend's life, offering to renounce his claim to the throne. His pleas echoed against cold stone. Katter looked up, offered a final salute. and was decapitated. Frederick collapsed, fainting before the blade even struck the block. When Frederick awoke, the boy who loved poetry was dead. The flute player had been buried in that courtyard. What rose from the stone floor was something entirely different. It was a mind that had learned the ultimate, horrifying lesson of power. To survive a monster, one must learn to operate the monster's machinery. Frederick submitted. He learned the military drills. He learned the logistics of war. He locked his soul away behind a mask of perfect, cynical obedience. The father thought he had broken the son. In truth, he had forged the most dangerous intellect in European history. In 1740, the soldier king died, and Frederick II took the throne. The philosophers of Europe rejoiced. They believed a philosopher king had finally arrived. Shortly before his coronation, Frederick had even written a treatise called the Anti-Machiavel, arguing against the ruthless, deceitful politics of Niccolò Machiavelli. He argued that a ruler should be the first servant of the state, guided by virtue and morality. Voltaire, the titan of the French Enlightenment, wept with joy. He thought Prussia would become an Athens of the North, a utopia of peace and intellect. But within months of his coronation, the philosopher king looked at the map. He saw the wealthy Austrian province of Silesia. He looked at the massive, perfectly oiled army his father had left him, a weapon that had never been fired. And without warning, without a formal declaration of war, without a single moral justification other than the raw calculation of power, Frederick invaded. The intellectual who wrote the Anti-Machiavel executed the most Machiavellian land grab of the century. This is the great paradox of Frederick the Great. He was a man who spoke the language of the Enlightenment while practicing the dark arts of absolute warfare. He used the wealth plundered from Silesia to build an opera house. He invited Voltaire to his court, holding brilliant philosophical debates over dinner, and the next morning he would ride out to command the slaughter of thousands. His intellect made him an unparalleled tactician. He mastered the oblique order, a maneuver requiring such extreme discipline that only his terrifyingly drilled Prussian troops could execute it. He would concentrate his forces on a single weak point in the enemy line, shattering armies twice his size. But his ambition nearly destroyed him. In the 7 Years' War, Frederick faced an apocalyptic coalition. France, Austria, and Russia, the three greatest empires of the continent, united to crush the Prussian upstart once and for all. For 7 years, Frederick fought a desperate, bleeding war of survival. His armies were decimated. He carried a vial of poison around his neck, fully prepared to end his own life rather than surrender. He watched his kingdom burn. He watched his men die by the tens of thousands. Yet, through sheer psychopathic endurance and a sudden stroke of luck when the Russian empress died, Frederick survived. He emerged from the ashes victorious, but deeply scarred. He had proved that Prussia was a great power, but at what cost? He spent his twilight years as a lonely, cynical old man, wandering his palace with his greyhounds, despising humanity. The philosopher had won the world, but he had frozen his own heart to do it. Frederick the Great expanded the borders, but his true legacy was invisible. It was the psychological architecture he left behind. By the end of his reign, Prussia was no longer just a kingdom, it was an idea. Let us pause and look at the society that allowed this machine to function. How do you convince an entire population to embrace such relentless hardship? You do it by fundamentally altering their concept of morality. In Prussia, morality was detached from religious salvation or personal happiness. Morality was redefined as a single word, duty. In German, Pflicht. The great philosopher Immanuel Kant, a loyal Prussian subject, wrote of the categorical imperative, the idea that one must act only according to a maxim that should become a universal law. While Kant's philosophy was profound and universal, in the hands of the Prussian state, it was weaponized. Duty became a secular religion. The individual was nothing but a fleeting shadow. The state was eternal. To maintain this, Prussia invented the modern world's most efficient tool of mass psychological conditioning, the mandatory public education system. We take public schools for granted today, but the Prussian model was not designed to create independent, critical thinkers. It was designed to create compliant citizens, obedient workers, and disciplined soldiers. The schoolroom was simply an extension of the barracks. Children were taught punctuality, hierarchy, and a fierce loyalty to the crown. A bell told you when to sit, when to stand, when to speak, and when to be silent. If you have ever felt like a cog in a machine while sitting in a classroom or an office cubicle, you are feeling the ghost of the Prussian Empire. Parallel to this was the creation of the civil service. The Prussian bureaucracy became famous worldwide for its incorruptibility and its mechanical efficiency. The civil servant, like the soldier, surrendered his individuality for the prestige of serving the grand apparatus. This was a society where the highest compliment was not that you were brilliant or kind or wealthy. The highest compliment was that you were useful. You functioned perfectly within your designated role. Prussia became a society of ants, building a fortress out of their own collective willpower. But machines, no matter how perfectly designed, eventually rust. When Frederick the Great died in 1786, he left behind a myth of invincibility. His successors inherited the magnificent uniforms, the perfectly straight marching lines, and the arrogant belief that the Prussian way of war was the ultimate science. They did not realize that the world had moved on. 2 decades later, a new storm broke over Europe. It did not come from a king, but from an emperor born of revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon did not fight with cold, mechanical lines. He fought with speed, chaos, and the furious, burning passion of a mobilized citizenry. In 1806, the ghosts of Frederick the Great marched out to meet the army of the future at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. The Prussians expected a glorious victory, relying on the rigid tactics of a dead king. What followed was not a defeat, it was an annihilation. The magnificent Prussian army was shattered in a single afternoon. Napoleon marched into Berlin, walked up to the tomb of Frederick the Great, and reportedly told his generals, "Hats off, gentlemen. If he were alive, we would not be here." The psychological collapse of Prussia was absolute. The state they believed to be invincible had been dismantled by a Corsican upstart. They were stripped of half their territory and forced to pay humiliating tributes. Yet, this is where the true resilience of the Prussian spirit revealed itself. Where other empires might have surrendered to the ash heap of history, the intellectuals and generals of Prussia turned inward. They realized a devastating truth. Frederick's machine had failed because it was mindless. The soldiers were fighting because they feared the whip, while the French were fighting because they loved their nation. Men like Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau realized that to defeat a monster, they had to evolve. They initiated radical, painful reforms. They abolished serfdom, freeing the peasants so they would have a country worth fighting for. They ended the aristocratic monopoly on the officer corps, allowing men of merit to command. They established the general staff, a collective brain trust of military geniuses that would become the envy of the world. Most importantly, they birthed the concept of the nation in arms. War was no longer the exclusive business of the king and his Junkers. War became the business of the people. They injected the cold, iron machinery of the state with the burning fire of nationalism. The phantom machine was rebuilding itself, and this time it would be infinitely more terrifying. There is a terrifying moment in the life of any monstrous creation when it no longer needs its creator. By the middle of the 19th century, the Prussian machine had healed from the trauma of Napoleon. It was awake and hungry. But it was no longer guided by a philosopher king. It was guided by an alchemist. His name was Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was not a monarch. He was a Junker, a creature of the old Prussian aristocracy, possessing an intellect so vast and cold that it chilled the blood of everyone in his presence. When the liberal parliament of Prussia refused to fund the expansion of the army, believing in the naive democratic dream of a peaceful Europe, Bismarck stood before them. He looked at the politicians, the dreamers, the men of words, and delivered a prophecy that would curse the 20th century. The great questions of the time, Bismarck thundered, will not be resolved by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood. He understood a dark psychological truth of human nature. Nothing unites a fractured people like a shared hatred. Bismarck did not want a sprawling, messy empire. He wanted a perfectly secure, unassailable Prussian fortress. And to build that fortress, he needed to unite the fractured German states under Prussian dominance. He orchestrated 3 wars with the precision of a master playing chess against children. First Denmark, then Austria. Finally, the trap was set for the ancient enemy, France. In 1870, he goaded the French Empire into a war they could not win. The Prussian military machine, now entirely mechanized, utilizing railways and telegraphs, descended upon the French like an industrial plague. In 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the absolute heart of French pride, Bismarck achieved his dark masterpiece. The German Empire was declared. The poison of total militarism, the absolute submission to duty, was injected into the veins of a new, massive nation. The sandbox of Europe was now the master of the continent. But the alchemist knew that he had created something too powerful. Bismarck spent his final years desperately trying to hold the beast back, weaving a complex web of treaties to prevent another war. He knew that the engine he built had no brakes. What happens when a machine built for war forgets how to stop? Bismarck was eventually dismissed by a vain, insecure young monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm loved the magnificent uniforms of Prussia, but he possessed none of the cold, rational restraint of his ancestors. He looked at the magnificent military apparatus and wanted to play with it. The tragedy of the First World War is not merely a tragedy of alliances or assassinations, it is the tragedy of the Prussian philosophy taken to its absolute, psychotic extreme. The General Staff, the collective brain of the army, had ceased to view war as a political tool. They viewed it as a mathematical equation. They drafted the Schlieffen Plan. It was a masterpiece of logistics, detailing exactly how many trains, carrying how many men, needed to move through Belgium to crush France in exactly 39 days. It was perfect. It was flawless. But it lacked one crucial element: humanity. It did not account for exhaustion, for panic, for the mud, or for the sheer grinding horror of industrial firepower. When the guns fired in August 1914, the machine was switched on. The clock began to tick. The young men of Germany, brainwashed by a century of Prussian education that glorified death in service to the state, marched into the meat grinder with horrifying obedience. They marched into the Somme. They marched into Verdun. They marched into clouds of chlorine gas and storms of artillery, believing that their duty was a shield. But iron does not care about honor. The machine malfunctioned. The 39 days turned into 4 years of apocalyptic slaughter. The Prussian ethos of the glorious cavalry charge dissolved into the filthy, rat-infested trenches. When the German Empire finally collapsed in 1918, starved and bled white, the Kaiser fled. The monarchy was dead, but the tragedy was far from over. The hardware of the Prussian machine was broken, but its software, the unquestioning obedience, the normalization of violence, the worship of the state, was still deeply embedded in the German soul. It was a phantom, waiting for a new master. From the ashes of the First World War, a new, infinitely darker darkness arose. The Weimar Republic tried to build a democracy on the ruins of an empire, but the ghost of Prussia haunted it. The people, traumatized by defeat and economic collapse, yearned for the return of order. They yearned for the uniforms, the discipline, the certainty of a strong master. Adolf Hitler did not create the Prussian machine, but he hijacked its corpse. On the day of Potsdam in 1933, Hitler, dressed in civilian clothes, bowed his head before President Paul von Hindenburg, an old, decorated Prussian field marshal. It was a piece of theatrical sorcery. Hitler was visibly grafting his radical, genocidal fanaticism onto the respectable, ancient tradition of Prussian duty. But the Nazis were not truly Prussian. The old Junkers, for all their ruthlessness, operated on a strict, cold code of honor and Christian duty. The Nazis operated on a hysterical, nihilistic madness. Yet, the old Prussian officer class, mesmerized by the return of military glory, swore a personal oath of absolute obedience to Hitler. They sold their souls. The machine that Frederick the Great had built for survival, that Bismarck had used for unity, was now weaponized for the extermination of millions. When the madness finally collapsed upon itself in 1945, the vengeance of the world fell upon Prussia. The Red Army of the Soviet Union rolled across the eastern borders. This was not a conquest, it was an annihilation. The ancient city of Königsberg, the coronation site of Prussian kings, the home of Immanuel Kant, was subjected to a firestorm so intense that the streets themselves seemed to boil. The Junkers, the aristocracy that had ruled for centuries, fled westward in the freezing snow, hunted like animals, their great estates burned to ash. In 1947, the victorious Allies gathered. They looked at the ruins of Europe and asked themselves, who is to blame? They did not just blame Hitler, they blamed the philosophy. They blamed the phantom. On the 25th of February 1947, the Allied Control Council issued Law No. 46. It read, simply, "The Prussian state, which from early days has been a bearer of militarism and reaction in Germany, has de facto ceased to exist. Together with its central government and all its agencies, Prussia is abolished." By the stroke of a pen, an entire nation was eradicated. Its name was wiped from the maps. Its lands were carved up and given to Poland and the Soviet Union. Its culture was outlawed. History offers few examples of a state being so utterly and deliberately deleted from the memory of the earth. Listen closely to the silence. Prussia is gone. The sands of Brandenburg have swallowed the marching steps of the Grenadiers. The great fortresses are tourist attractions. Königsberg is now Kaliningrad, a Russian naval base, its German past buried beneath brutalist concrete. But ideas do not die just because you erase their borders. Look around you. Look at the modern world. Look at the rigid schedules of our schools, designed to move children from room to room by the ringing of a bell. Look at the staggering bureaucracies of our governments and our corporations, where human beings are reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet, their value measured only by their efficiency and their compliance. Look at the modern obsession with order, with productivity, with the relentless sacrifice of the self for the benefit of the system. We look back at the Prussian Empire and we shudder at its cold, mechanical heart. We tell ourselves that we are free. We tell ourselves that we are individuals. But when you sit at your desk, when you obey the silent, unyielding demands of the modern apparatus, when you sacrifice your peace for the sake of your duty, ask yourself, did the Allies truly abolish Prussia? Or did the phantom simply leave its physical body behind to inhabit the architecture of the entire modern world? The map is empty, but the machine is still running.